The popping noise is getting louder, realize they're gunshots, and they're coming closer and closer to the library, and they're throwing off these handmade bombs that they had made, these pipe bombs in the hallway. So there's big explosions as they're coming towards the library. And immediately when they walk in, they're shooting off their guns, and they're taunting or making fun of students before they shot or killed them. And they're talking to one another, and they're treating it like it's a game. They're peeking underneath a table saying peekaboo, and they'd shoot a girl.
Where were you born and what was life like growing up for you?
I grew up in Littleton, Colorado. I had 3 older sisters and a little brother, and kind of grew up lower middle class, went to a great school, had a pretty loving family. My parents divorced when I was younger, but the great thing about them, they never talked bad about each other after the divorce, and so have a great relationship with all my family, and just had a good childhood, riding bikes, playing street hockey, getting into little fights with my siblings, but apologizing by the end of the day. And really, all these years later, now my siblings are my best friends. When I look back and I see like old footage and pictures of when I was little, I see there was a lot of sweetness, a lot of like innocence, and a lot of kindness in my family.
Tell me a bit about Rachel. What was her personality like?
My sister was a very real person, just very authentic. She also had a great sense of humor. Her and I were a little at odds because at the time I was in grade 10, she was in grade 11. And at that time, like what I cared about was wanting to be popular. That was like my fantasy. It was like, if I could be the popular, cool person in the in crowd, and I cared about that, and she didn't care about that. The morning of the shooting, I was in the bathroom perfecting my hair, and my sister was waiting for me in the car. I was making us late yet again, and I get into the car and she's getting on to me about making us late, and we get into an argument on our way there. She was listening to some faith-based radio station. I wanted to listen to some rap, so I changed the station. She changed it back, and we get into this little radio station war, finally listening to what I wanted to. And so the last moment I had with her was calling her names and slamming a car door shut and walking into school. She actually would take me to the front of the school, drop me off, and then she would go park, which I didn't even realize at the time was an act of kindness. Even though I was making us late, she was dropping me off at the front and parking. So I slammed the car door shut, and I remember I can see her face, and that's the last time I saw her. And I walked into school. It was a beautiful spring day. It was April 20th, 1999. And I went to my classes. I had a test later in the day in biology. And on the night before, I was on the phone with a friend, Matt Kechter, the first time we ever had been on the phone together. And I was going to the library and saw him at a table, went over to go study with him. Right before going to the library, I didn't do this often, but I walked outside and I just took in the mountains the Colorado Rocky Mountains are in the backdrop of the school. Like, here's the school, and then there's the mountains. And it's this beautiful spring day, and I just took it all in. And then I walked back up into the library, and it literally was like the calm before the storm, like this beauty moment. So I'm up in the library, I'm studying for this test, and then I hear these poppy noises coming from outside. It's near the end of the school year, so I think some seniors, some kids in grade 12 are pulling a prank and bringing firecrackers or fireworks to school. So I'm hearing these poppy noises, and I'm looking around the room, and I see another friend that's on the wrestling team, and we make eye contact. We're kind of like laughing, like looking at each other like, what is that noise? Like, oh, some seniors must be pulling a prank. And a few minutes go by, and this teacher runs into the room. She's very frantic. She runs over to the phone, gets on the phone to call the police, and starts yelling at all of us to hide and get underneath tables. And I'm wondering, is she part of this prank? Like, not sure what's going on. but she's very frantic. And then I see a kid that walks in that's covered in blood all over his shirt, and he kind of falls down at the door. And still it doesn't register what's going on. So I listen to this teacher. I get underneath the table with my friend Matt. And then my friend Isaiah was walking by, and he was looking for a place to sit. So I called him over. I said, "Hey, Isaiah." And he comes over and he sits next to me. The popping noise is getting louder, realize they're gunshots, and they're coming closer and closer to the library, and they're throwing off these handmade bombs that they had made, these pipe bombs in the hallway. So there's big explosions as they're coming towards the library. And immediately when they walk in, they're shooting off their guns, and they're taunting or making fun of students before they shot or killed them. And they're talking to one another, and they're treating it like it's a game. They're peeking underneath a table saying peekaboo, and they'd shoot a girl. They'd jump on top of a table and shout. At one point, get anyone with a white hat on. A lot of jocks or people that played sports at our school wore white baseball caps with like sport logo teams. And I had one on, so I took it off and I put it underneath my shirt. And so I heard one conversation that they had with a girl. At one point, one of the shooters walked by her and she said, "Oh God," and it caught his attention. He said, "God, you believe in God?" And she started begging for her life, and he kept asking, "Do you believe in God?" And she kept begging, and finally she said yes, and then I heard a bunch of gunshots and then didn't hear her crying anymore. So I'm underneath this table and I'm hearing this chaos and just total fear, paralyzing fear. I feel like my heart is gonna stop beating because it's just pumping so fast. But I'm remaining still. I'm being totally quiet, totally still, just not gonna draw any attention to myself. One of the shooters walks by, he sees Isaiah. Isaiah was one of the very few black students at my school. Eric was one of the shooters, and he idolized Hitler. And even though the other shooter was actually Jewish, and he would do stupid things like they were in a bowling class and they would hi Hitler if they hit a strike. And so Dylan called Eric over when he saw Isaiah, who was black. And they then started calling him racial slurs, Isaiah, and they tried to drag him out from underneath the table. And the last thing that Isaiah said was, "I want to see my mom." And they shot and killed Isaiah, and then they shot and killed Matt. And, the last thing that Isaiah said was, "I want to see my mom." I thought that was, that at least he was thinking about that in his last moments, not like on this hatred coming from these two guys, but like his mom crossed his mind. And it's true that your family, loved ones, like that kind of crosses your mind a little bit in those moments, the people that are most important to you. So I'm lying there in shock. I'm there in my friend's blood, and they then continue around the room. My ears at that point were ringing very loud. I thought they were bleeding, and I thought I was going to die. They continued to go around the room for a little bit, and then they left, and then they went down into the cafeteria, and that's where you see footage of them for the first time going down, and then one of them's wearing a black trench coat, and they begin to shoot propane tanks that they had left behind that morning that they were hoping would explode. Those propane tanks were directly beneath me. I was on the second floor in the library. If they had detonated, I would have been immediately killed. But here I am underneath that table, and I don't even know that they've left the room. The alarms are going off. There's smoke in the room. There's kids that are moaning that had been shot, girls that are crying. But I stood up, and I was the first student to stand up in the room. I looked around, and I saw the shooters were gone. And I yelled at everyone, "Come on, let's get out of here." And I heard someone asking for help, and I turn around. Behind me is a girl who's had her shoulder blown off from a shotgun blast, and she's rocking back and forth asking for help. And so I helped pick her up, and a group of us, about 30 of us, ran out of an emergency exit, and there's a police car in a field a distance away, and we all ran behind to get behind that police car. And shortly after we got behind that police car, the two shooters came back into the library. They began to exchange gunfire with the police, and I realized if we didn't get out of there just in that time, more of us would have been killed. Behind the police car, there was a girl named Val Schnur. I was holding her because she was wanting to go to sleep, and for some reason I knew you're not supposed to go to sleep if you're losing blood. And so I was trying to keep her awake and telling her she's going to be okay. And then other police cars began to come by and pick up students. And right before I left, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "I think there's a girl that's been shot over there." And I look out from behind the police car, and I don't realize it at that moment, but I was looking at my sister. And so a police car picked us up, took us to a nearby street. I got on the phone, and the first thing I did was call my mom, and the first thing I said was, "Mom, I'm okay, but I think there's something wrong with Rachel." Went home, and the whole night waited for her to call or to show up. I was in a complete state of shock, blood all over me. And my family was very shocked to see me, but they were glad that I was okay. They were very shocked to see blood all over me. And we got a call the next morning from the sheriff's department, and they said that Rachel was the first one that was killed. My mom came down to my room to tell me the news, and I knew what she was going to tell me before she told me. And I knew also that she was really worried about me. They had no idea what I had been through, but I wanted to alleviate her worry. So when she came down, she said, "We just got a call. Rachel was killed." And I put my hands on her shoulders, and I said, "Mom, I'm going to be okay."
And who were the two shooters?
So I met the two shooters one time before. I didn't know them, but I've gotten to learn about them since then. And Eric Harris was kind of the leader between the two shooters. He brought Dylan in on his plans to do this shooting, and he planned it for over a year. And he didn't really have any good reason for it. He wasn't ostracized so much at school. He wasn't beat up all the time. You can't look at it and go, that makes sense why he would do this. He came up with his own reasons, but he dwelled on a lot of very dark media over the internet. He played the game Doom constantly. In fact, he changed out the faces and set in the game Doom. You're this shooter and you kill demons. And instead of killing demons, they were good with computers, and he put kids' faces from schools on the demons. So he'd be killing kids. And Dylan was suicidal. He lacked self-worth. He didn't believe in his own value.
What was your sister's relationship with the shooters?
So my sister knew the shooters. She had a class with them, and she also worked on a couple productions with them, school plays. In fact, a few weeks before the shooting, Dylan spotlighted my sister during a talent show. When she was killed, according to police reports, she was shot at a distance 3 times. The shooters' original plan was to let these propane tanks go off and then shoot kids as they were fleeing from the school. But the bombs failed to go off, so they, out of frustration, they got out of their cars, came up to the school, and the first person that they came across was my sister eating lunch with a friend outside. And they shot her from a distance, and then, according to the boy that was with her, who's now paralyzed for life, they began to mock her and say, "Where's your God now?" They knew she was a Christian. They knew she was a person of faith. And she was begging for her life. And the last moment of her life was Eric picked her up by her hair and said, "Do you still believe in God?" And she said, "You know I do." And he said, "Well, go be with him." And she took her last shot, execution style, we know from the police report.
And what were those next few days like for you and your family after hearing about Rachel's death?
Yeah, so the next few days after the shooting were very surreal. We were getting calls from news media for interviews, but we also had an outpouring of support. We had people showing up at the house from the church, friends. We had a park next to our school that was completely filled up with letters, cards, posters, flowers, stuffed animals. My sister's car became like a shrine, completely covered. You couldn't even see the car with, like I said, flowers, letters, poems, people sending their thoughts our way. And then, for years after that, I think I was treated with a lot of sympathy, compassion, and I think that was helpful for me. I remember my house was filled with people for the next couple weeks. I mean, there were just people that were coming over, some people we didn't know. And I met someone who's now one of my best friends, but was kind of a mentor. He was a youth pastor, but I met him the day after the shooting. He was in our living room. He saw me on a piano bench, and he said some older people were probably trying to talk to me, console me, but I was just like totally out of it, just like a zombie, and not really present. It's called disassociation, where you kind of disconnect from the world around you, and your mind is just trying to process, and you're just in your own little world. So you could sit there and talk to me, but I wasn't really present. And he saw me, and he was like, he knew I was a wrestler, and he was a wrestler. And so he's like, "I'm gonna get this kid out of here and just take him for a walk." So he took me for a walk, and it was the first time that I told somebody all that I went through, and he just went like ghost white, like in shock from hearing me tell in detail. And since that time, he and I have been connected as good friends.
Can you tell me a bit about initially after that day, how you felt towards the shooters?
I watched on the news media, the shooters were, over time, it felt like to me, being portrayed almost like victims themselves, because people are trying to understand why. And so the story that began to come out, which wasn't the real story, which was, oh, these kids were picked on so bad, and that's why this happened. And that's not really why Columbine happened. That was a part of their why, a little bit, but it wasn't even the main part. Watching that story, like, oh, they were the victims, made me angry. Because I watched as they came into the library and shot poor girls that they had never met, and killed Isaiah, and taunted them, and made fun of people while they were doing it. If you hold on to anger and hate towards anything in your life long enough, it makes you bitter, and you begin to take it out in areas on people that don't deserve it. And so I, at one point, chose to forgive the two shooters, and for me, it was a process. And it was partly after I'd met someone who had been through a lot worse. I went to Africa when I was 18 on a summer trip, on a mission trip. And I met someone who had lost everyone. And it was during the apartheid, and he came home to his village, and his whole village had been killed with machetes by a rival tribe. And he had lost 17 members of his family. And this man, he took us into the refugee camps every day on a bus, and he'd always be singing these beautiful Zulu songs. One night we were up late, and I used to have a lot of nightmares and very violent dreams, and I'd wake up and I'd be kind of angry. In my dreams, there was a shooting happening, and I was either fighting bad guys or I was running for my life and watching people die, and so I'd wake up in a very bad mood. And on this trip, I woke up and started walking around our campsite that we were, and he pulled in, and I wasn't supposed to be out, and he asked me what I was doing. And he could tell I was upset, and he said, "Tell me your story." And I had told him what happened to me. I told him about Columbine and about my sister and my friends and these guys that I hated. And then he told me his story and told me about coming home to find 17 members of his family being killed. And when he told me this, I didn't at first believe him, because I thought, how could you be so filled with joy and singing these songs every day on the bus? How could you be this person of peace and joy and have lost everything? And he said to me, forgiveness is like setting a prisoner free and finding out that prisoner is you.
How do you feel seeing and hearing about subsequent school shootings as a survivor of a school shooting yourself?
There were 12 students and a very brave teacher that were killed that day at my school. There's been many more school shootings that have happened, and a lot more worse shootings as far as the amount of lives taken. But that was the first mass school shooting that happened in the United States. I would have a lot of feelings that came over me that I felt after Columbine. I kind of re-immersed into a little bit of trauma. When the events would happen, it would stop me from my progress. And now I don't let that happen. I don't let it faze me in a good way. I still want my heart to not become hardened and not feel, but I don't want to be slowed down in my work. I don't want it to stop me from what I need to do that very day. It's kind of like the shooters, they've had a goal of causing all this death and destruction. I don't want them to take anything else away.
And what are your thoughts on gun control in the US from your experience?
Yeah, good question. I think gun control is an issue that comes up after every school shooting that happens. And I think there's a number of issues that contribute to why a shooting happens. I'm all for legislation that would help make it more difficult for somebody that's on the hinge to quickly get a firearm. But at the same time, that's not the main thing. The main thing that's happening is what's happening with that person. And that's where my focus has been.
How often do you think about Rachel, and how do you kind of keep her memory alive?
I don't think about Rachel every day, but I do think about her. Actually, yesterday I was driving to New York, and I just started talking to her, like as if she could hear me. And when I do that every once in a while, not often, but it's just kind of these special moments, because I would imagine like her, like seeing me all these years later, still kind of living out things that she wanted to do. Her story has given me a place in this world that otherwise I wouldn't have, to make a positive difference. And so when I think about her last moments, it's a little bit of it's just a reminder of what I'm supposed to do, which is continue to make a positive impact through this story. I just hope that and believe that I'm making her proud, and that, I have a belief, hopefully, that I get to see her again one day.
One of them suddenly aimed their gun towards me because I was standing right in front from a distance, and shot me on the face. The first bullet I received on the face, I still remember that I screamed really loudly, because that was probably one of the first bullets that broke my teeth and my maxilla and that pierced through my face.